Hey guys, we are going to be moving on to a slightly more complex but interesting and critical topic today, especially if you are looking to stay in DeFi Kingdoms for the longer term. I'll be covering hero summoning mechanics in detail so you not only know how it works, but how to set yourself up for the best possible outcomes. A big shout out to Mr. Zipper and his Medium articles, especially this portion on Appendix A. It really helped me significantly in my understanding, and I hope this video does the same for you. To begin with, we need to know that each hero has one dominant gene and 3 recessive genes. So in this example, for hero 48540, you can see that his dominant gene is a monk, which means when you look at his card, he will be reflected as a monk. To be able to find out what the rest of the recessive genes are, you will have to go to this website called dfk-professions.com, key in your hero ID, click submit, and you'll be able to have a look at the rest of the recessive gene. Understanding your hero's dominant and recessive genes are important because this has an implication on summoning, which I will explain in details now. Bear in mind at this time, we are only discussing how the child hero's dominant gene is determined. The recessive genes will be discussed later. I want you to think of this as a 3-step process. The first step is the summoner gene selection, whereby it accounts for the dominant and recessive genes of the parents, also the summoners, as each of these genes are given a predetermined probability of being passed on to the child as its dominant gene. The next thing that will be considered is if there is any potential for a mutation opportunity to a higher hero class tier. For example, a pair of basic heroes summoning an advanced class child. So once the first 2 steps are done, then the final step will be to have the final gene selection to determine the child's dominant gene. I understand it may sound really technical here, but I will try to clarify this with some examples. In the first example, we'll be looking at parents who are not pure with no potential mutation combinations. Before I move on, some definitions here. What do I mean by pure? Pure just means that the parent's dominant and recessive 1 gene is aligned. For potential mutation combinations, the question here is, are you summoning based on the pairs as reflected in this chart? If yes, then there is a potential for mutation, which means that you might summon a child hero that is of a higher hero class tier. So going back to the 3-step process which I shared about earlier, the first step is when each of the dominant and recessive genes of the parents are given a predetermined percentage that the child hero will adopt this gene as the dominant gene. These percentages are standardized, so as you can see, the dominant gene holds a 75% chance, followed by 18.75 for the recessive 1, 4.69 for the recessive 2, and 1.56 for recessive 3. Because the corresponding genes of the 2 summoners are not compatible for a potential mutation, there is essentially no step 2 in this example. In step 3, the final gene selection, we need to account for 2 sets of genes because there are 2 parents. In this case, we need to account for the weightage as over 200 percentage points and not 100. So using the archer as the example, we need to take 75% over 200 percentage points, and that gives it the final probability of 37.5% of being selected as the child's dominant gene. If you have a repeated class as seen with the warrior here, then you can add up the respective weightages to give it its final probability. The algorithm will then pick the child's dominant gene based on this set of probabilities. In scenario 2, we have a situation where the parents are still not pure but with a potential mutation combination. In this case, we need to take into account step 2 of the 3-step process and account for the probability of this mutation happening. The archer and the thief is the compatible pairing to be able to summon the Dark Knight, and to calculate the probability of that happening, we have to take 75% multiplied by 75%. This is taken from the chance that the dominant gene of a parent will be passed on to the child, multiplied by 25%, because this is the predetermined successful percentage for a basic hero to mutate or to summon an advanced hero. We will then get a 14.06% possibility of this happening, and this impacts the chance of the parent's dominant genes being passed passed on to the child. It is now reduced because of this probability of mutation, and therefore we have to take away 14.06% from the initial 75% chance to get 60.94% as reflected here. The same final step tree will then be applied after the potential mutation is being accounted for. The child's dominant gene will then be selected based on this final set of probability, but this time with the dark knight included. In the final example, we have a situation whereby both the parents are pure and there are possible mutation combinations. Generally, this will follow a very similar process as scenario 2, but we need to account for the additional probability that a dark knight can be summoned because the parents' R1 genes are also a potential mutation combination. To calculate the additional probability, we use the same formula, but instead of 75%, we now use 18.75% multiplied by 18.75% because this is the predetermined percentage that the child will adopt the parents' R1 genes as its own dominant gene. We derive the additional probability of 0.879%, and similarly we have to deduct that off the predetermined percentage of R1, and that will give us 17.87% as reflected here for R1, and similarly for the dominant gene as well. As we have done in the previous scenario, we do the same here. As more genes of parents are possible mutation combinations, the probability of a child becoming a dark knight is higher, as seen in this final set of probability that determines the child's dominant genes, and that is why pure breeds are highly sought after. Looking at the 26,000 heroes summoned over the 4 parent class combinations, the average rate of success is also at about 15% too. That basically concludes how the dominant gene of a child hero is determined. Focusing on pure breeds, the next thing of importance is the child hero's R1 gene. This slide basically shows you how, but the key thing here to note is that the parent's R1 gene has the biggest influence over the child's R1 genes as well. So this reiterates why pure breeds as parents are highly sought after, because even if you do not get an advanced class mutation from summoning, there is a good chance for a pure breed child. Aside from the child hero's genes, the other two things noteworthy are the number of summons that the child hero will have and the generation of the child hero. This slide explains it quite clearly. So the number of summons your child hero will have will always be the lesser of the two summoning parents' remaining summons minus 1. The generation of your child hero will always be 1 greater than the greater of the two parents. The examples here should illustrate that well. The cost of summoning is determined by two things. One, the generation of the summoners, and secondly, the number of heroes that it has summoned historically. So in my example here, let's take it as Summoner 1 is a Gen 1 doing its first summon, so that will cost you 16 jewels, and Summoner 2 is a Gen 2 doing its 5th summon, that will cost you 34 jewels. So the total cost here will be 16 plus 34 jewels, and you also need to take into account the Gaia's tiers that are needed to summon. After doing this deep dive, I'm starting to think that to buy heroes of earlier generations with maximum summons available makes sense. While it may be more expensive upfront, it may actually be more value for money or even profitable in the longer run. Think about it, the cost to summon is somewhat fixed, but the floor price is always impacted and influenced by supply and demand. And in my previous video, if we do expect this demand to rise, then it will cost more to buy a hero from the floor eventually. Being a supplier of good quality heroes then sounds attractive, doesn't it? Before I go through the other reasons that make summoning attractive, I wanted to make sure I put this caveat across. Using pure breeds with full summons available as reference, it currently makes sense to look for Gen 1 or Gen 2 parents. That's because the floor price of pure breeds with full summons available is currently at about 80 jewels. Gen 1 and Gen 2 heroes at max summon will cost you 68 and 84 jewels respectively. At this final summon, you might either be in slight profits or in break even, but the thing to note is that all your previous summons, having cost lesser, would have been much more profitable. Comparing this to Gen 3's first summon, it would already cost you 72 jewels and therefore be not lucrative at this point in time. However, I do expect higher gen summoning to be more lucrative attractive or to start to make sense as the floor price rises along with the demand. Personally, these are the two reasons why I find summoning attractive. One, it gives you good control of your heroes and it puts you in the best position to get advanced class mutations. Secondly, with summoning, there is a possibility of us being able to summon heroes with higher rarity. This chart is great because it breaks down the probability of that happening in every situation. That's all you need to know about summoning, and more importantly, how to get more control over the quality of your heroes at a fair price. Doing this deep dive did trigger me to review my current heroes. In my first video on DeFi Kingdoms, I did mention that there will come a time for this once you start to consider summoning and combat aspects of the game. The time may well be now, considering how lucrative summoning can be, especially with a long-term view. Stay tuned to find out my phase 2 plans for DeFi Kingdoms. Bye for now.